when Ethan first suggested Ash Ridge for our weekend getaway. The idea thrilled me. Tucked away in the sprawling expanse of Pennsylvania's Allegheny National Forest, it was as remote as it was reputed to be haunted. Perfect for a photographer like me, hungry for the mysterious and the unexplained. Ethan, ever the protector, had his reservations, and Maya, always eager for an adventure, needed no convincing. The drive there was a mixture of excited chatter and the hum of tires on long stretches of highway. The deeper we ventured into the forest, the denser the woods became, swallowing us in shades of green and brown. "It's beautiful," Maya breathed, her nose practically pressed to the window. "It's isolated," Ethan countered, his eyes never leaving the road, a frown knitting his brow. He caught my eye in the rearview mirror, a silent conversation passing between us. I smiled, squeezing his shoulder reassuringly. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows through the towering trees. The campsite was a small clearing, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to press in curiously close. As I unloaded our gear, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I chalked it up to the excitement and the eerie stories I'd read about Ash Ridge. Setting up camp went smoothly enough except for my camera gear. Every piece seemed to act up. Batteries that I had charged the night before were inexplicably dead, and my spare lenses seemed to fog up the moment I tried to capture the twilight settling over the forest. "It's just the cold," Ethan said, noticing my frustration. But the air wasn't that cold, and I knew something wasn't right. As darkness enveloped our camp, the atmosphere shifted. The usual nocturnal symphony of the woods was oddly muted, replaced by a silence so dense it felt like a weight upon our ears. We gathered around the campfire, its crackling flames a small comfort against the growing unease. "Do you guys hear that?" Maya's voice was barely a whisper, strained with tension. "Hear what?" Ethan's voice was skeptical, but I heard it too. A faint whisper, as if the wind was murmuring secrets just beyond our reach. The whispers grew, a soft cacophony of indistinct voices that seemed to echo from the shadows. I grabbed my camera, determined to capture whatever was lurking just out of sight. The display showed nothing but the dark woods, but as I snapped a photo, a chill ran down my spine. The image revealed more than just trees. There were figures, human in shape but terribly distorted, their limbs elongated and faces blurred. "We need to stay inside the light," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Maya nodded, her usual vibrant energy dimmed by fear. Ethan, though clearly disturbed, maintained his composure, throwing more wood onto the fire. The night stretched on, every sound amplified in the silence. The figures didn't come closer, but their presence was oppressive, almost suffocating. We huddled together until the first light of dawn filtered through the trees. Morning brought a temporary relief. The figures were gone and the forest seemed normal, sounds of wildlife returning. Yet the sense of dread lingered like a bad taste. We debated leaving, but curiosity, and my need to understand, overruled our fear. We decided to stay one more night, a decision we'd soon regret. Throughout the day, we explored the area, Ethan reluctantly leading the way. The forest was beautiful, but felt unnaturally still, as if holding its breath. Returning to the camp as evening approached, the sense of foreboding returned. As night fell, the whispers resumed, louder now. Shadows danced at the edge of our vision, always just out of reach of the firelight. Maya, pale and quiet, pulled a small book from her backpack. "There are legends," she said, her voice trembling, old stories of a Wendigo that hunts these lands. It's drawn to human despair. The pieces clicked into place, a horrifying picture forming. The drained batteries, the malfunction in equipment, our escalating fear, all signs of its presence. "It's watching us," I whispered, peering into the dark. "Waiting." "We need to protect ourselves," Maya said, her hands shaking as she turned the pages. She instructed us to draw a circle around our camp with ash and to place iron objects at the cardinal points. Iron and ash, they'll keep it at bay. We moved quickly, following her directions with desperate precision. The circle complete, we sat back, the barrier between us and the creeping shadows palpably tense. The night grew wild, the wind howling as if angry. The whispers turned to growls just beyond the circle of ash. We saw it then. The Wendigo. It was horrific, a skeletal figure with gaunt features and eyes that burned with hunger. It paced the line of ash, its growls vibrating through the crisp air. "Stay in the circle." Ethan's voice was firm, his arm around my shoulders protective. The creature tested the barrier, its form shimmering with each gust of wind, but it couldn't cross. The iron glinted under the moonlight, and the ash held firm. We spent the night in vigil, exhausted but unyielding. By the time dawn broke, the creature was gone, the pressure in the air lifting with its departure. We packed up silently, the memory of the night's terror fresh in our minds. As we left Ash Ridge, the forest seemed to watch us go, its secrets once again hidden in the shadows. Back in the safety of our home, the images I captured were all the proof we needed that what we experienced was real. Ethan, once a skeptic, couldn't deny the evidence. Maya's beliefs had saved us. Her knowledge of the old stories our only shield against the darkness. I shared our story and the images on my blog. It went viral overnight. Messages flooded in, some from others who had experienced similar horrors, others from those too terrified to venture into such places. We had survived Ash Ridge, but the echoes of that place lingered with us. We were changed, more aware of the thin veils between our world and the ones that whispered just beyond. And somewhere deep inside, the call to return, to face the shadows once more, whispered like a siren's song. I've always considered myself rational, a man who values evidence over folklore. That's what brought me to Deep Creek in the first place. Stories of disappearances linked to an area of the Smoky Mountains that locals call the Vanishing Trail. The legends spoke of spirits, the whispering ones, luring people into the mist, never to return. Ridiculous, I thought. Until it wasn't. The trailhead was empty when I arrived except for a battered RV parked near the edge of the lot. Its owner, a wiry man with a weathered face, was perched on a folding chair, sipping coffee and surveying the woods like a sentry. "You headed up the trail?" he asked as I got out of my truck. "Yeah, I'm writing a piece on the disappearances. Heard this area has a reputation." He gave a grim chuckle. "That's one way to put it. You're not the first to come poking around. Most don't last long." "Why's that?" "The forest doesn't like strangers," he said, leaning forward. "It'll turn you around, make you see things that ain't there. Some folks say the whispering ones take you, but it's simpler than that. You get scared, you get lost, then you're gone." I nodded politely, though I didn't believe a word of it. "Thanks for the warning." He grinned, but there was no humor in it. "Just stay on the trail, and if you hear your name, don't answer." The first few miles were uneventful, the trail weaving through dense, shadowy woods. I stopped occasionally to take photos of the carvings I'd read about, spirals and crude symbols etched into tree trunks. The shapes seemed random, almost haphazard, but something about them felt deliberate, as if they were meant to mark something. Around midday, I met Brooke. She appeared out of the mist like an apparition, tall and confident, with a heavy pack slung over one shoulder. "Trail gets tricky ahead," she said, pausing to catch her breath. "Mind if I tag along?" I hesitated. I'd planned on hiking alone, but her presence was reassuring in a way I couldn't quite explain. "Sure, I'm Eric." "Brooke," she replied. "You here for the ghost stories too?" "Sort of," I said, deciding not to elaborate. "You?" Her expression darkened. "I'm looking for someone, a friend. She disappeared out here a few years ago." I didn't press for details, and she didn't offer any. We walked in silence for a while, the forest growing denser, the trail narrower. The first sign that something was wrong came when my GPS failed. One moment, it was showing the trail winding toward a ridge. The next, the screen went blank. "Dead battery?" Brooke asked, glancing at my device. "No, it was fully charged this morning." She shrugged. "Electronics get weird out here. Better stick to the markers." That was easier said than done. The carvings I'd seen earlier became less frequent, and the trees all started to look the same. A strange echo accompanied our footsteps, as if someone, or something, was walking just behind us. "You hear that?" I asked, stopping abruptly. Brooke nodded. "Keep moving." By dusk, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like wind through the trees, but as the shadows deepened, they grew clearer. Voices, soft and melodic, calling our names. "Eric!" The sound froze me in place. It was Hannah's voice, my estranged brother's wife. No, not her, but close enough to send a shiver down my spine. "Don't answer," Brooke said sharply, grabbing my arm. "It's not real." We pressed on, but the whispers followed, weaving through the trees like a chorus of unseen singers. Brooke's face was tight, her knuckles white around the strap of her pack. "They know us," she murmured. "What do you mean?" "They're not random. They call to you because they know you'll listen." Night fell quickly, and the mist thickened, swallowing the trail. Brooke led the way, her flashlight cutting weakly through the fog. I followed, clutching my map like a lifeline, even though it no longer made sense. Then we came upon the footprints. "Those are ours," I said, pointing to the trail ahead. "Except they're going the wrong way," Brooke replied, her voice shaking. She was right. The prints were identical to ours, but reversed, as if we'd been walking backward. "This isn't possible," I muttered, but the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. "It's them," Brooke said. "They're trying to confuse us. We need to keep moving." We stumbled into a clearing just as the moon broke through the mist. At its center stood a pile of stones, worn smooth by time and weather. Symbols were carved into each one, spirals and jagged lines that matched the markings on the trees. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "An altar," Brooke said. "They built these to mark their territory." I noticed a small, leather-bound book wedged between two of the stones. When I picked it up, the pages crumbled slightly, but the text was still legible. It was a journal, written in a scrawling, desperate hand. "Beware the whispers. They know your regrets. They will not stop until you are theirs." The forest came alive as we left the clearing. Shadows moved in the mist, flickering at the edges of our vision. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, until I could no longer tell if they were outside my head or within it. Then I saw him. He stepped out of the mist, a tall, shadowy figure with glowing, hollow eyes. My breath caught in my throat as recognition struck me like a blow. "Jason?" I whispered. It wasn't possible. My brother hadn't spoken to me in years, not since the argument. Not since I'd accused him of stealing from our parents and pushed him out of my life. But here he was, or something that looked like him. "Eric," he said, his voice dripping with sorrow, "why did you abandon me?" I stumbled back, shaking my head. "You're not real." "He feels real, doesn't he?" Brooke said, her voice cutting through the fog. She was staring past me, tears streaking her face. Her own illusion was speaking to her, though I couldn't see or hear it. "They feed on regret," she said, her voice trembling. "You have to let it go, Eric. It's the only way." The whispers rose to a crescendo as the shadowy figure stepped closer, its arms outstretched. "I'm sorry," I shouted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I should have been better. I should have forgiven you. I should have been there." The figure paused, its hollow eyes flickering. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of humanity in its gaze. Then it was gone. The mist began to lift as we stumbled back onto the main trail. The whispers faded, replaced by the familiar rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. We didn't speak until we reached the trailhead, where Dale was still sitting in his folding chair, sipping coffee as if nothing had happened. "You're lucky," he said as we approached. "Not many make it out once they start whispering." Brooke gave a weak laugh. "Thanks for the tip." I left Deep Creek the next morning, shaken but alive. I never wrote the article. Some things aren't meant to be explained, but every so often I hear my name on the wind, soft and familiar, and I wonder if the forest is still calling me back. I didn't come to Devil's Hollow looking for trouble. Trouble found me anyway. When I rolled into the tiny gravel lot at the trailhead, I couldn't help but feel a pang of unease. The surrounding forest was too quiet, too still, like it was waiting for something. I told myself it was just my imagination. I wasn't here to be spooked by local ghost stories. I was here for research. History is full of strange, forgotten corners, and Devil's Hollow was one of them. A 19th century cult called the Circle of the Void had reportedly lived here, performing rituals to summon something. The locals called it a demon. I called it folklore. Either way, the group vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but wild rumors and scattered carvings in the trees. I was hoping to piece together enough for a presentation back at the high school where I taught. Anything to distract myself from the empty house waiting for me. My wife, Hannah, had been gone 6 months now. Cancer. It wasn't quick and it wasn't kind. Coming here felt like running, but what else could I do? The trail was rougher than I'd expected, twisting through dense pines and rocky outcroppings. My trailer, parked at the edge of the lot, had been my home base for countless trips like this. But something about Devil's Hollow felt different. My GPS kept glitching, refusing to load the map, and my flashlight flickered no matter how many times I replaced the batteries. By the time I set up camp near the creek, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I was struggling with the firewood when she appeared. "Need a hand?" Her voice startled me, and I turned to see a woman standing just beyond the tree line. She was tall and athletic, with short cropped hair and a camera slung over her shoulder. "Didn't think anyone else was crazy enough to camp out here," I said. She grinned, stepping closer. "I could say the same about you. I'm Laura, by the way." "Marcus," I replied. "What brings you out here?" "Exploring. Heard about the cult stuff and couldn't resist. You?" "Same, more or less." I motioned to the small fire I'd managed to coax to life. "You want to sit for a bit?" Laura didn't need much convincing. We talked for a while, her excitement about the local legends clashing with my more grounded approach. She was bold, reckless even, but I had to admit she knew her stuff. "Ever hear about the carvings?" she asked, gesturing toward the dark woods. "Supposedly, the cult left symbols all over the trees to mark the boundaries of their rituals." "I've read about them," I said. "Haven't seen any yet, though." "You will," she said, her tone lighter than it should have been, "if you stick around long enough." That night, I heard them. Whispers. At first, I thought it was a wind brushing through the pines, but the sound grew sharper, more deliberate. Low voices, murmuring just out of reach. Marcus. My name. The sound cut through me, cold and clear, and I froze in my sleeping bag. It wasn't Hannah's voice, but it carried the same gentle cadence, like she was calling me from another room. "Marcus, come here." I grabbed my flashlight, heart pounding, and stepped out of the trailer. The forest was pitch black, save for the faint glow of my dying fire. The whispers grew louder, coming from the direction of the creek. "Hello," I called, feeling foolish the moment the word left my mouth. The only response was the soft rustle of leaves. Then I saw it. A faint, flickering light moving through the trees, like someone carrying a lantern. Laura's warning from earlier echoed in my mind. "You will if you stick around long enough." I stayed where I was, watching the light until it disappeared. Eventually, the whispers faded, and I returned to the trailer, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, Laura found me by the creek, examining the strange markings etched into the bark of a tree. They were crude spirals and jagged symbols unlike anything I'd seen before. "Told you," she said, snapping a picture with her camera. "I saw a light last night," I admitted, "like a lantern, and I heard something, calling my name." Laura raised an eyebrow. "Spooky. Maybe the stories are true." I rolled my eyes, but the truth was, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. We spent the day hiking deeper into the forest, following a narrow path that twisted through rocky terrain. The carvings became more frequent, and the air grew colder, even though the sun was high overhead. Around noon, we stumbled upon an old stone altar, half buried in moss and surrounded by more symbols. It was a crude thing, barely more than a slab of rock, but it carried an unsettling weight. "This must have been one of their ritual sites," Laura said, kneeling to inspect the carvings. "Check this out." She held up a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and weathered. The pages inside were filled with messy handwriting, describing rituals and chants in disturbing detail. "This is incredible," she said, flipping through the journal. "It's like a first-hand account of the cult." I wasn't so sure. The words felt heavy, like they carried a power I couldn't explain. One phrase scrawled over and over caught my eye. "Beware the shadow. It feeds on fear." That night, the forest came alive. It started with the humming, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then came the growls, low and guttural, like some massive predator circling the camp. Laura clutched the journal like a talisman, her face pale in the firelight. "What the hell is that?" Before I could answer, the fire blew out, plunging us into darkness. My flashlight flickered to life, and I swung the beam toward the sound. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, impossibly so, with elongated limbs and glowing red eyes that burned like embers. Its body was a shadow, shifting and writhing like smoke, but its presence was overwhelming. The shadow of the void, the thing the cult had summoned. "Run," I said, grabbing Laura's arm. We bolted into the woods, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The growls followed us, along with the sound of snapping branches and heavy footsteps. No matter which way we turned, the carvings seemed to lead us back to the creek. "You can't run," a voice rumbled, deep and resonant. It came from the creature, but it carried the same cadence as Hannah's. Laura stumbled, and I pulled her to her feet as the shadow loomed closer. "The journal," she gasped. "There has to be something in there about stopping it." We ducked behind a fallen tree, and Laura flipped through the pages, her hands shaking. "It says, it feeds on fear and regret. That's how it keeps people trapped here." I stared at the shadow as it closed in, its eyes boring into me. I thought of Hannah, of how I'd failed her in the end, letting my own fear of losing her keep me from being there when it mattered most. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "I'm sorry for all of it." The shadow paused, its form flickering. The growls quieted, and for a moment the forest was still. "It's working," Laura said, grabbing my arm. "Keep going." I let her down, I said, my voice breaking. I wasn't strong enough. The shadow let out a low, guttural sound, almost like a sigh, and began to dissolve, its form breaking apart like ash in the wind. The humming stopped, and the air grew warmer. Laura and I sat there in stunned silence, watching as the forest returned to its unnatural stillness. By dawn, we made it back to the trailhead. The truck started without issue, and the road out of Devil's Hollow felt straighter, easier, as if the forest was letting us go. I haven't been back since, and I don't plan to, but I can't escape the feeling that something followed me out of those woods. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the humming again, faint but unmistakable, and I wonder if the shadow is still waiting for me to return. I didn't choose Bitter Creek for its charm. It wasn't a place you went for scenic views or friendly neighbors. It didn't even show up on most maps. But that was the point. I needed somewhere quiet. Somewhere I could think without distractions or the pitying looks of friends who didn't know what to say anymore. The divorce had gutted me, plain and simple. So, when Tommy Whitaker, the owner of a supply store near the edge of Ouachita National Forest, mentioned Bitter Creek, it sounded perfect. "You sure about that place?" he asked as I paid for propane and a fresh tarp for the trailer. His leathery face wrinkled into something between a grin and a grimace. "What's wrong with it?" Tommy leaned on the counter, lowering his voice like we weren't the only ones there. "Folks say it's cursed, something about a witch, Abigail Hawthorne. You know, back in settler times. Story goes, her neighbors strung her up on account of some bad crop seasons and livestock dying off. Before she kicked the bucket, she cursed the whole valley." "Sounds like a great tourist pitch," I said, rolling my eyes. Tommy chuckled but didn't push the subject. "Just stay out of the creek if you hear voices, and don't follow the lights." I chalked it up to local folklore. Every out-of-the-way place has a ghost story, and most of them are about as scary as a flashlight under your chin. The trail to Bitter Creek was rougher than I'd expected. My trailer bounced behind the truck like it was ready to break loose, and the winding road seemed to go on forever. By the time I reached the campground, a flat, gravel clearing surrounded by towering pines, the sun was dipping low in the sky. I parked, unhitched the trailer, and went through the usual routine, securing the tarp, setting up the propane stove, and checking the generator. The whole time I felt like someone was watching me, but when I glanced around I saw nothing but trees. By dusk, I had a small fire going and a lukewarm beer in my hand. That's when she arrived. "Nice setup you've got," the woman said as she stepped into the firelight. She couldn't have been much older than 30, with a camera slung over her shoulder and a carefree smile that didn't belong this deep in the woods. Thanks," I said, startled. "I'm Ellie," she said, sitting cross-legged by the fire without waiting for an invitation. "Jimmy," I replied, "you camping nearby?" "Just up the trail. Thought I'd say hi before it got too dark." We made small talk for a while. She was a photographer, out here for a travel blog, drawn by the same rumors Tommy had mentioned. Unlike me, Ellie found the stories fascinating. "You don't believe any of it?" she asked. "Nope," I said, popping open another beer. "Ghost stories are just a way to scare kids into behaving." She shrugged. "Maybe, but don't you ever feel like some places hold on to things?" The first night was uneventful, aside from a faulty generator that cut out around midnight. I spent an hour fiddling with it by flashlight before giving up and heading to bed. I woke to the sound of whispers. At first, I thought it was Ellie, but when I poked my head out of the trailer, her tent was zipped shut. The whispers grew louder, weaving through the trees like a current of air. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was low and urgent, like someone arguing just out of earshot. I stepped back into the trailer and locked the door. It was just the wind, I told myself. By morning, the whispers were gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling they'd been real. Ellie joined me for coffee by the fire, her camera already snapping pictures of the creek. "Did you hear anything last night?" I asked. "Nope," she said. "Why?" "No reason." We spent the day hiking, following the creek as it twisted through the valley. Ellie darted ahead, photographing everything from moss-covered rocks to the sunlight filtering through the pines. I kept an eye on the water, half expecting to see something wrong. Around noon, we came across something that stopped both of us in our tracks. It was a weather journal lying half buried in the mud near the creek. The leather cover was cracked and brittle, but the pages inside were dry. "Think it's real?" Ellie asked, flipping through the pages. "It's old, that's for sure." The handwriting was barely legible, but one phrase stood out. "Beware the lights." That night, the lights appeared. I was sitting by the fire staring at the flames when I saw them out of the corner of my eye. Small, flickering orbs hovering over the creek. At first, I thought they were fireflies, but they moved too deliberately, bobbing and weaving in a slow, hypnotic pattern. "Ellie, come look at this," I called. She stepped out of her tent, camera in hand, and froze when she saw the lights. "What the hell are those?" "I don't know. Maybe marsh gas?" "Marsh gas doesn't move like that." We watched in silence as the lights drifted closer. "Let's go check it out," she said, already moving toward the creek. "Wait." I grabbed her arm. "Tommy said not to follow the lights." "You believe him now?" "I believe we don't know what they are. Stay here." Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped toward the creek. The lights seemed to retreat as I approached, drawing me deeper into the woods. Then I heard the voice. Jimmy. It was soft and melodic, like my ex-wife calling me from another room. My grip on the flashlight tightened as I scanned the trees. Jimmy, come closer. I ran back to the campsite. Ellie was standing by the fire, her face pale. You heard it too? I asked. She nodded. The next day, we agreed to leave. But when I turned the key in the truck's ignition, it wouldn't start. The hell's wrong with it? Ellie asked, pacing. I popped the hood, but everything looked fine. The battery was charged and there was gas in the tank. It just wouldn't start. We'll hike out, I said, though the thought of leaving the trailer made my stomach churn. The hike was worse than I'd imagined. The trail seemed to loop back on itself, leading us in circles no matter which direction we went. Ellie's usual optimism faded as the hours dragged on. We're not getting out of here, are we? She said, slumping against a tree. We'll figure it out, I said, though my own confidence was waning. That's when we saw her. A figure stood in the distance, her silhouette framed by the trees. She wore a long, tattered dress, and her hair hung in dark, matted strands over her face. Do you see that? Ellie whispered. Yeah. The figure raised an arm, pointing toward the creek. Hell no, I muttered, grabbing Ellie's hand. We're going the other way. Night fell quickly, and with it came the whispers. They were louder now, circling us like vultures. The lights returned, darting between the trees, casting eerie shadows. Ellie clutched the journal like it was a lifeline, flipping through the pages by a flashlight. It says something about appeasement, she said, her voice trembling. To break the curse, you have to confront your guilt. That's great, I snapped. What guilt? Ellie didn't answer, but her eyes were fixed on something behind me. I turned, and there she was, the witch. Her face was hollow and sunken, her eyes burning like embers. She glided closer, her tattered dress dragging along the ground. Jimmy, she crooned, her voice shifting into my ex-wife's. Why did you let me go? I stumbled backward, shaking my head. You're not real. She stepped closer, her skeletal hand reaching out. Why did you fail? It hit me then. The divorce, my failures, the bitterness I'd carried for years. I'd blamed everyone but myself. I'm sorry, I whispered, falling to my knees. I'm sorry for everything. The witch paused, her head tilting as if she was listening. The whispers faded and the lights dimmed. Then she was gone. Ellie and I made it out of Bitter Creek the next morning, bruised but alive. The truck started without issue, and the road seemed straighter, easier. I haven't been back since, but some nights I dream of her, the witch, her ember eyes watching, waiting. Maybe some places do hold on to things after all. I arrived at Whispering Pines National Forest just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the treetops in amber and gold. The quiet here wasn't the soothing kind. It was oppressive. A stillness that seemed to press against my trailer as I set up camp. It was just what I needed. A place where no one would find me, where the memories of Sarah and Lily couldn't follow. I parked near a lake so still it could have been glass, bordered by towering pines. As I unhitched the trailer, I caught a faint giggle, high-pitched and distant. I froze, my ears straining for a follow-up, but there was nothing. Just the breeze shifting through the trees. Shaking my head, I brushed it off as nerves. That evening, I lit a fire and opened the photo album. It was habit by now, something to anchor me when the silence grew too heavy. The pages were worn from use, the corners of the photos smudged where my fingers had lingered. There was Lily, laughing as she played with the dog in the backyard, her hair in a wild tangle of curls. And Sarah, leaning against the doorframe, smiling like she had all the time in the world. My chest tightened. They were gone, but the weight of their absence never left. I was jolted from my thoughts by the crunch of footsteps on gravel. I turned, half expecting to see someone standing by the fire, but the campsite was empty. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small against the vastness of the woods. No response. The fire crackled behind me, and for the first time I felt truly alone. The next morning, a knock on the trailer door startled me. I opened it to find a woman in a ranger's uniform, her auburn hair tied back in a loose braid. "You must be Caleb," she said with a warm smile. "I'm Nina, just checking in on campers." "Didn't expect company out here," I said, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "We like to make sure everyone's safe. These woods can be unpredictable." She glanced toward the lake, her smile fading. "You're pretty deep in. Stay on the marked trails and don't wander after dark. The forest has a way of keeping people if they're not careful." "Keeping people?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Old legend," she said, waving it off. "Locals call it the Children of Whispering Pines. Just keep your wits about you." She left before I could press her further, disappearing down the trail. That afternoon, I decided to take a short hike. The trail wound through dense pines, the canopy above filtering sunlight into fractured beams. I wanted to believe I'd chosen this place for its beauty, but the truth was simpler. I was running from the grief, the guilt, the crushing silence of an empty house. About a mile in, I found it. A rusted swing set hidden in a small clearing. The metal creaked as the wind shifted it back and forth, though the air was still. At its base lay a single, mud-encrusted shoe, small enough for a child. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. It was like stepping into someone else's nightmare. I turned back, my feet crunching against the trail, and that's when I heard it. "Come play with us," a voice whispered. I spun around, but the clearing was empty. When I returned to camp, I found her. She was sitting by the fire, her legs swinging back and forth as if she didn't have a care in the world. A little girl, no older than 6, with tangled dark hair and wide, haunting eyes. "Hey," I said, stepping forward cautiously. "Where'd you come from?" "I'm lost," she said, her voice soft and sing-songy. "Can you help me find my friends?" She didn't look scared, which made me uneasy. Kids who were lost didn't act like this. "Where are your parents?" I asked. "They're gone," she said simply, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Against my better judgment, I brought her into the trailer, offering her a blanket and some water. She ignored the food I set out, instead staring at the photo of Lily on the table. "She's pretty," the girl said. "Was she your favorite?" I felt a lump rise in my throat. "She was my daughter." "She's still here," the girl said with a smile, pointing toward the window. I turned, my heart pounding, but there was nothing outside except the trees. When I tried to report her to Nina, my phone refused to connect. Even the ranger station's emergency radio was silent. I was starting to think the little girl wasn't lost, at least not in the way I'd thought. The next morning, I found a newspaper clipping on my trailer step. The edges were yellowed, the text faded but legible. Whispering Pines Orphanage shrouded in tragedy. Dozens of children vanish without a trace. The article described a fire that gutted the orphanage in the 1950s. Most of the children had escaped, but some fled into the forest and were never seen again. Locals believed their spirits still wandered the woods, seeking revenge or companionship. I looked up from the clipping, my stomach sinking. The little girl was gone. That evening, Nina returned, her face grim. "I've been trying to get in touch," she said. "You've seen her, haven't you?" "The girl?" I asked. "She said she was lost." Nina shook her head. "She's not lost. She's part of the forest. They all are." "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then sighed. "The children, they don't let go. They draw people in. If you're not careful, you'll end up like them." I wanted to laugh, to dismiss it as superstition, but something about her tone stopped me. That night, the forest came alive. I woke to the sound of Lily's laughter outside the trailer, clear and bright, just like I remembered. My chest tightened. I knew it couldn't be real, but I couldn't stop myself. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the darkness. The laughter led me deep into the woods, where the trees grew denser and the air colder. The light from my flashlight barely pierced the gloom, but I kept moving, drawn by that familiar sound. In a small clearing, I found another child, a boy this time, his face pale and his eyes dark hollows. He pointed to a crumbling structure in the distance, barely visible through the mist. The orphanage. The orphanage was a shell of its former self, its walls charred and crumbling. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of smoke and decay. And there, standing in the center of the room, was the girl. "I told you," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "She's here." "She's not here," I said, my voice trembling. "You're lying." The other children appeared, stepping out of the shadows one by one. They formed a circle around me, their faces blank and their eyes empty. "You left her," they whispered in unison. "You let her die." The weight of their accusations crushed me, my knees buckling under the pressure. My grief, my guilt, it was all consuming, a tidal wave I couldn't escape. Nina's voice broke through the haze. "Caleb!" she shouted, her flashlight cutting through the dark. She stepped into the circle, holding a bundle of sage and a lighter. "Get out of here!" I staggered to my feet as she lit the sage, the smoke filling the room. The children screamed, their forms flickering like static on an old TV. "You can't have him!" Nina shouted, her voice steady despite the chaos. The girl's face twisted into something monstrous, her features elongating and her eyes glowing red. "You can't take him from us," she screeched. But the smoke worked. The children dissolved, their cries fading into the night. By the time we made it back to camp, the sun was rising. The forest was quiet again, but the memory of what I'd seen lingered. "Thank you," I said, my voice hoarse. Nina nodded. "Don't come back, Caleb. This place doesn't let go." I packed up my trailer and left without looking back, the weight of my grief feeling lighter than it had in years. But as I drove away, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror, the swing set in the clearing, swaying gently in the wind. I parked my trailer under the shadow of a towering red sandstone butte, the kind you see on postcards from Monument Valley. This was what I needed: silence, solitude, and an endless stretch of desert to forget the wreckage of my life. The divorce, the job I lost, the friends I alienated. Out here, none of it mattered. The desert didn't care. After leveling the trailer and setting up camp, I settled into a lawn chair with a beer. The sun was setting, casting fiery reds and golds across the horizon. It should have been peaceful, but something felt off. The air was too still. No birds, no insects, not even the faint rustle of wind. I brushed it off. Maybe I just wasn't used to this kind of quiet anymore. It was just after dark when I heard him. "Hey, is someone there?" The voice was shaky, desperate. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. A young guy in a torn hiking jacket stumbled toward the campfire. He looked like he'd been out here for days, his face sunburned, his dark hair matted with sweat. "Whoa, whoa," I said, raising my hands. "You okay, buddy?" I got lost," he panted, doubling over. "Been walking for hours. Saw your fire." His name was Eli, a backpacker who'd underestimated the desert. He looked like the type who thought hiking boots and a water bottle were all you needed to survive out here. I gave him some water and a can of chili, and he wolfed it down like he hadn't eaten in days. "You got a map?" I asked. "Yeah, but it doesn't make sense. The trails just stop." "You're probably reading it wrong," I said, but he shook his head. "No, man. I've been on a lot of trails. This one's different. Like, it's not just the map, it's the place." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Eli looked around like he didn't want the desert to overhear him. "It doesn't feel right. Like something's watching." That night, I couldn't sleep. Eli crashed on the floor of the trailer, snoring like a chainsaw, but I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint, high-pitched whistle. I sat up, straining to hear. At first, I thought it was a wind, but it was too deliberate, rhythmic. It rose and fell like a haunting melody. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the whistle growing louder. It seemed to come from the far side of the camp, near the rocks. "Hello?" I called. The whistle stopped. I shone the beam of light into the shadows, my pulse quickening. Nothing moved, but the hairs on my neck stood up. Then I saw it, just for a second, a pair of glowing eyes reflecting back at me, too high off the ground to be a coyote. I backed away, locking the trailer door behind me. The next morning, we had a visitor. A woman in a dusty SUV pulled up to the campsite. She introduced herself as Marla, a local historian who ran tours for tourists. She wasn't much for small talk, just gave us a tight smile and a warning. "Be careful out here," she said, glancing at Eli, "especially at night." "Why?" Eli asked. Marla hesitated, then sighed. "This land, it's got a reputation. Locals say it's cursed. Skinwalkers." "Skinwalkers?" I echoed. "Shapeshifters," she explained. "Part of Navajo folklore. They can take the form of animals or people. They use fear and isolation to lure their prey." Eli's face paled. "Have you seen one?" "No," she said a little too quickly, "but I've heard stories. People disappearing, strange voices, tracks that go nowhere." She turned to me, her eyes serious. "If you hear anything strange, don't follow it, don't leave the light, and whatever you do, don't trust anyone out here." Eli couldn't stop talking about Marla's warning. "You think it's real?" he asked as we hiked a short trail later that afternoon. "No," I said flatly. "It's just a story." "But what about the eyes you saw last night?" "Probably a bobcat or a fox, but—" "Drop it, Eli." He fell silent, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. The trail was harder than I expected. The sun was brutal, and the rocks seemed to radiate heat. Eli had to stop every 10 minutes to catch his breath. "We should turn back," I said. "Just a little farther," he insisted. We rounded a bend and found ourselves in a small clearing. At the center was a pile of stones arranged in a circle, with strange symbols etched into the largest one. "What the hell is this?" I muttered. Eli crouched beside it, running his fingers over the carvings. "It's old," he said, "like really old." The air felt heavier here, the silence oppressive. I didn't like it. "Let's go," I said. Eli hesitated but followed. That night, things got worse. I woke to the sound of Eli screaming. I bolted upright, grabbing my flashlight. He was outside, standing near the rocks, his face pale with terror. "It's here!" he shouted. "What's here?" He pointed, but I didn't see anything. Then, slowly, I noticed a shape moving in the darkness. It was low to the ground, hunched like an animal, but its limbs were all wrong. Too long, too thin. The beam of my flashlight landed on its face, and I felt my stomach drop. It looked like Eli. The same features, the same clothes, but its eyes were hollow and its mouth was stretched into an unnatural grin. I grabbed Eli's arm and pulled him back to the trailer. "What the hell is that?" he stammered. "A skinwalker," I said, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. We stayed in the trailer, locking the doors and turning off the lights. Outside, we heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. "Jack," a voice called. It sounded like Marla. "Don't trust it," I whispered to Eli. "Jack, it's me," the voice insisted. "Marla, you have to let me in." Eli moved toward the door, but I grabbed his wrist. "That's not her," I said. "How do you know?" "Because she wouldn't be out here at night." The voice stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl. The trailer shook, and we heard claws scraping against the metal walls. "Stay calm," I told Eli, though my own hands were trembling. By morning, the trailer was a mess. Claw marks covered the walls, and the tires had been slashed. The truck wouldn't start, no matter how much I tinkered with the engine. "We're stuck," I said grimly. "What do we do?" Eli asked, his voice shaking. I thought of Marla's warning. "Don't trust anyone. Don't leave the light." "We wait," I said. The day passed slowly. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the thing's face. Eli's face, twisted into that grotesque grin. By nightfall, the tension was unbearable. Eli was pacing, muttering to himself. I could tell he was losing it. "We have to leave," he said. "We can't stay here." "We can't go anywhere," I reminded him. "We'll die if we stay," he snapped. Before I could stop him, he threw open the door and ran into the darkness. "Eli," I shouted, chasing after him. I found him standing in the clearing, staring at something in the shadows. "What are you doing?" I hissed. He turned to me and my blood ran cold. His eyes were empty, his face slack. Then he grinned. The real Eli stumbled out of the darkness, his face pale and terrified. "It's not me," he shouted. "Jack, it's not me." I looked between them, my heart pounding. One Eli stood stiff and unnatural, the other trembling and panicked. "Kill it," the trembling one said. I grabbed a rock and swung. The fake Eli crumpled, its body dissolving into ash. We didn't sleep. By dawn, the truck's engine roared to life, though I hadn't touched it. "Let's go," I said. Eli didn't argue. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. A coyote stood on a distant ridge, watching us. Its eyes glowed faintly, and I could have sworn it was smiling. I parked my trailer at Crescent Lake just as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the Olympic Mountains, casting long shadows over the dense pine forest. It had taken me hours to find a spot this remote. That was the point. Peace and solitude. The kind I craved after my career imploded. No angry calls, no headlines dragging my name through the mud. Just the hiss of wind through the trees and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. I killed the engine and stepped out, stretching my legs. The air was damp and cool, tinged with the faint metallic smell of the lake. For a moment, I just stood there, soaking in the quiet. Then I noticed how still it was. No bird song, no rustling leaves, just silence. Heavy and unnatural. The first person I met was the park ranger. He arrived as I was unhooking the trailer, a middle-aged guy with a sun-weathered face and an old rifle slung across his back. "Evening," he said, tipping his hat. "Name's Pete." "Jack," I replied, offering a hand. He shook it, but didn't smile. His eyes flicked to the lake, then back to me. "You camping here alone?" "Yep, just me." Pete hesitated like he wanted to say something but thought better of it. Instead, he pointed toward the water. "Don't go out there after dark, and stick to the marked trails. People tend to get turned around out here." "I'll keep that in mind," I said, brushing him off. "Good," he muttered, then walked off, disappearing into the trees. That night, I built a fire by the water's edge. I sat there, nursing a beer, listening to the crackle of the flames and staring at the reflection of the moon rippling on the surface of the lake. It should have been relaxing, but something about the stillness gnawed at me. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, the fire was just embers and the air had turned icy. I reached for my jacket, but I froze when I heard it. The faint sound of splashing, like someone wading into the lake. I peered into the darkness, but the shoreline was empty. My eyes strained against the gloom, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement. A shadowy figure standing waist-deep in the water. But when I blinked, it was gone. "Get a grip, Jack," I muttered, retreating into the trailer. The next morning, I met Maya. I was rinsing my coffee mug when she appeared out of nowhere, all smiles and messy hair. She was younger than me, maybe mid-20s, with a backpack slung over one shoulder. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, nodding toward the fire pit. I hesitated. Solitude was the whole point of this trip, but her grin was disarming, and I figured a little company wouldn't hurt. "Sure," I said. She plopped down and started rummaging through her bag. "You camping here long?" "Just a few days." "Cool. I've been on the road for weeks. Crescent Lake's supposed to be gorgeous, but, man, this place gives me the creeps." "Creeps?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You know about the settlement, right? The one that used to be here? They say the settlers all drowned, cursed by some spirit tied to the lake." I laughed. "You actually believe that stuff?" She shrugged. "I think there's more to the world than we understand. Don't you?" Before I could answer, Pete appeared. His sudden arrival made Maya jump. "Mornin'," he said curtly, his eyes lingering on Maya. "Mornin'," I replied. "Something wrong?" Pete's gaze shifted to the lake. "Just checking in. Remember what I said? Stay on the trails, and don't go near the water at night." Maya waited until he was gone before breaking into a grin. "Spooky? What do you think he's hiding?" "Nothing," I said, though Pete's warnings were starting to gnaw at me. That afternoon, Maya convinced me to hike with her. The forest was thick and overgrown, the air damp and heavy. Every so often, I caught the faint smell of rot, like something long dead. We followed a narrow path that curved around the lake, eventually stumbling across an old plaque, half buried in moss. The words were faded, but I could make out just enough. "To the settlers of Crescent Lake, who defied the warnings and paid the ultimate price." Maya knelt beside it, her fingers tracing the letters. "Defied the warnings," she murmured. "What do you think that means?" "Superstitions," I said, "probably scared themselves into drowning." She looked at me, her expression unreadable. Or maybe they were right. That night, the whispers started. I was lying in bed, staring at the trailer's ceiling, when I heard it, faint and indistinct like wind through the trees. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then it grew louder, coalescing into a single word. "Jack!" My blood ran cold. I bolted upright and threw open the door, stepping into the frigid night air. The lake was calm, the forest still. But there on the shore were footprints, wet and impossibly large, leading from the water to my trailer. A splash drew my attention to the lake, where a shadowy figure stood knee-deep in the water. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stared at me with hollow, empty eyes. By morning, I was ready to leave. "I'm done," I told Maya, packing up my gear. "Something's wrong with this place." "You saw it, didn't you?" she said, her voice tinged with excitement. I nodded. "Whatever it is, I don't want any part of it." Maya frowned. "But we can't just leave. We have to figure out what's happening here." Before I could argue, Pete appeared, his face grim. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked. "What is it?" I demanded. Pete hesitated, then sighed. "It's tied to the settlers. They stole something they shouldn't have, a carved idol, sacred to the tribes that lived here. The spirit, it's been punishing anyone who trespasses ever since." Maya's eyes lit up. "Where's the idol now?" Pete shook his head. "No one knows, but it doesn't matter. The spirit isn't something you can reason with. Best thing you can do is leave." "I tried," I said. "The trailer won't start." Pete's face darkened. "Then you've got bigger problems." Maya convinced me to help her search for the idol. She was convinced it was the key to ending the hauntings. I wasn't so sure, but with the trailer dead and the whispers growing louder, I didn't see any other choice. We hiked to a spot Maya had marked on her map where the old settlement was rumored to have stood. The forest grew denser as we walked, the air colder. By the time we reached the clearing, it felt like we were walking into another world. The ruins were barely visible, just a few crumbling foundations hidden beneath moss and vines. But as we searched, Maya found something buried in the dirt. A small, carved idol, weathered by time, but still intact. "We did it," she breathed. A shadow fell over us, and the air grew icy. The whispers swelled into a deafening roar, and when I looked up, I saw it. The entity. It towered over us, its form shifting and twisting like smoke. Its hollow eyes bored into me, and I felt my knees buckle. "Leave it!" I shouted, grabbing Maya's arm. "No!" she cried. "We have to give it back!" The entity lunged, and I shoved her aside. The next few moments were a blur. I grabbed the idol and ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The entity was everywhere, its whispers filling my head, its shadowy tendrils clawing at my heels. Somehow I made it back to the lake. "Take it!" I shouted, throwing the idol into the water. The effect was immediate. The whispers stopped and the air grew still. The entity froze, its form dissolving into mist before vanishing altogether. Maya and I left Crescent Lake the next morning. We didn't talk about what happened. I didn't tell her about the nightmares that would follow me, the whispers, the shadowy figures standing at the edge of my vision. And as I drove away, leaving the trailer behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a terrible mistake. In the rearview mirror, I saw it, the entity, watching from the shore, waiting. I parked my trailer in the shade of a towering pine and stepped out into the muggy Florida air. The Apalachicola National Forest stretched out before me, endless and green, its dense pine groves broken only by patches of swamp. I was here for solitude, after the fallout from my last article, an expose that backfired spectacularly. I needed time to clear my head and figure out my next move. What better place than the middle of nowhere? The campsite was quiet, just a few other campers spread out along the loop. I didn't expect company, which suited me fine. I unpacked my gear, set up my table and chair, and tried to enjoy the stillness. By nightfall, though, the stillness felt oppressive. I kept catching myself glancing at the trees, half expecting something to emerge. Ridiculous, I told myself, but the feeling didn't go away. The first night, I heard the whispers. It started as a faint murmur, rising and falling with the breeze. I figured it was just the wind threading through the trees. Then the sound shifted, becoming distinct. Words. I couldn't make them out, but they were there, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. I stepped out of the trailer with my flashlight and scanned the woods. Nothing moved, but the whispers stopped the moment I opened the door. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I met Rebecca. I was sipping coffee at my campsite when she appeared, a woman in her 30s with a weathered backpack slung over one shoulder. She gave me a friendly wave as she walked over. "Hey, mind if I sit?" she asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from me. "Go ahead," I said, surprised by the interruption. I hadn't seen anyone else nearby. "Rebecca," she said, extending her hand, "I'm camping a couple of sites over, doing some environmental research." "James," I said, shaking her hand, "journalist, but on a break." "Ah," she said, her eyebrows raising slightly. "Researching anything interesting?" I shook my head. "Not this time, just trying to get some space." She nodded, looking out at the forest. "Well, if you want something interesting, you should check out the old military installation out here." "Military installation?" I asked, curious despite myself. "Yeah, it's been abandoned for decades. Locals say the government was running experiments here in the 50s. Some kind of weapons research. Supposedly, a lot of the soldiers stationed there died or disappeared." She smirked. "And of course, the place is haunted." "Of course," I said, rolling my eyes. "Hey, don't knock it till you see it," she said, standing up. If you're curious, the trail starts near the big pine grove on the south side. Just don't go alone." By midday, my curiosity had won out. I followed Rebecca's directions and found the trail she'd mentioned, a narrow path cutting through the forest. It wasn't on the map, but the faint footprints suggested people still used it. The air grew cooler as I walked, the pines thickening around me, their shadows long and strange. After about an hour, I found it, the installation. The building was squat and crumbling, half swallowed by the forest. Its concrete walls were cracked and moss-covered, and an iron door hung askew, creaking softly in the breeze. My heart quickened as I stepped inside. The air inside was stale, heavy with the smell of mildew and rust. Graffiti covered the walls, some of it crude, some unsettling. Symbols I didn't recognize. I found an old control room with shattered monitors and strange, rusted equipment. A desk in the corner held a stack of faded documents. I brushed off the dust and flipped through them, but the words were smeared and incomprehensible. One phrase, however, stood out, circled in thick black ink. "They are watching." The whispers returned then, soft and insistent, echoing off the walls. My flashlight flickered. I turned toward the doorway and saw it, just for a moment. A figure standing in the shadows, featureless, its edges blurring like heat waves. I froze, and it was gone. I practically ran back to my trailer, my pulse hammering. The forest felt darker than before, every shadow deeper, every sound sharper. When I finally reached the campsite, Rebecca was there, leaning against a tree with a concerned expression. "You went, didn't you?" she said. "How did you know?" "You have that look," she said grimly, "like you've seen something you can't explain." I hesitated, then told her about the whispers, the figure. Her expression darkened as I spoke. "I should have warned you more," she said. "This place, it's not just ghost stories. There's something out here, something real." "What do you mean?" She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "My grandfather was stationed here in the 50s. He disappeared during one of their tests. My family never got answers, but I've spent years trying to piece it together. Whatever they were doing out here, it wasn't normal." Her words sent a chill through me. "Do you think it's dangerous?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but it's tied to that installation somehow, and now it knows you're here." That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers were louder now, circling the trailer, growing more distinct. At first, they were just words I couldn't make out. Then they became voices I recognized. "James?" one voice called. It was my editor, the one who'd fired me. "You're a fraud. You ruined everything." "James," another voice said, softer. It was my ex-wife. "You were never good enough." I covered my ears, but the voices didn't stop. My trailer shook, the windows rattling. Then came the knocking. Soft at first, then louder, insistent. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. Nothing. Just the forest, silent and still. But when I turned back, I saw it in the reflection of the window. The figure, standing behind me. I spun around, but it was gone. The next morning, I found Rebecca by the lake. She looked as shaken as I felt. "It's getting worse, isn't it?" she asked. I nodded. "It's like it knows everything about me, my failures, my regrets." She swallowed hard. "That's what it does. It feeds on your memories, your guilt. That's how it lures you in." "What do we do?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. She hesitated, then said, We have to go back to the installation. There's something there, something it doesn't want us to find. I think it's the only way to stop it." We returned to the installation that afternoon, the forest seeming darker than before. The whispers started as soon as we stepped inside, louder this time, overlapping in a chaotic hum. The walls seemed to pulse, the graffiti almost glowing. In the main control room, Rebecca found something I'd missed, a trap door hidden beneath a pile of rubble. We pried it open, revealing a narrow ladder descending into darkness. My stomach twisted, but I followed her down. The basement was worse. The air was suffocating, the whispers now deafening. We found a long corridor lined with cells, their doors hanging open. Inside one, Rebecca froze, her flashlight trembling. It was a dog tag, tarnished and worn. She picked it up, her eyes widening. "It's my grandfather's." Before I could respond, the lights flickered and the whispers stopped. The silence was worse, pregnant with tension. Then it appeared, the figure standing at the end of the corridor. This time it didn't flicker. It was solid, human-shaped but wrong, its face a shifting void. It stepped closer and the air grew colder. Rebecca gripped my arm, her breath shallow. "It's not real," she whispered. "It can't hurt us if we don't let it." But the figure spoke, its voice a twisted blend of my editor's and my ex-wife's. "James, you'll never escape who you are. You'll always fail." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to look away. "You're not real," I shouted, my voice echoing. The figure froze, its edges unraveling like smoke, but the whispers surged, the walls shaking. The corridor began to collapse, chunks of concrete falling around us. "Run!" Rebecca yelled. We scrambled back up the ladder, the ground trembling beneath us. We barely made it outside before the building caved in, sending up a plume of dust. The forest was silent again, the whispers gone. Back at the campsite, we sat by the lake, our nerves frayed. Rebecca stared at the dog tag in her hand, her expression unreadable. "What now?" I asked. She looked at me, her eyes fierce. "Now we make sure no one else goes back there." I nodded, pulling out my notebook. For the first time in months, I felt the urge to write. Not for a story, not for my career, but to make sense of what had happened, to make sure it wasn't forgotten. The forest seemed to watch us as we packed up and left, its secrets buried beneath the ruins. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Not really. Some things never truly let you go. The forest had a stillness to it, the kind that wasn't comforting. I stepped out of my trailer into the cool morning air, the trees of the Sawtooth National Forest looming overhead. The campsite was empty, just me and the woods. It should have been perfect, a chance to disconnect, clear my mind, and maybe make progress on the book I'd been procrastinating for years. A collection of ghost stories, legends from forgotten places. Fitting, really, considering why I'd come out here. After my younger brother, Caleb, died, I'd been looking for something, anything, that might make sense of the weight pressing on me. I set my coffee down on the picnic table and unfolded the map I'd picked up at the ranger station. Most of the trails were marked and straightforward, but there was one that caught my eye. Faint and unlabeled. It forked off from a main trail and disappeared into a dense patch of forest. I traced its path with my finger, curiosity stirring. Maybe it led to something worth writing about. Later that morning, I met Sam. He came by as I was packing a small day bag, his orange vest and wide-brimmed hat marking him as one of the trail maintenance crew. He was in his 60s, with leathery skin and eyes that had seen more than they let on. "Morning," he said, tipping his hat. "Heading out?" "Yeah, thought I'd explore a bit," I said. "Looks like there's an old trail nearby, leads somewhere called Prospect Hollow." Sam's face darkened. He shifted his weight, his boots crunching the gravel. "You don't want to go poking around there." "Why not?" He hesitated, then sighed. "That trail's been closed for years. Not safe, overgrown, easy to get lost, and—" He trailed off, looking toward the forest as if the trees might hear him. "People talk about strange things out there. Whispers, shadows, stuff that don't make sense." "Ghost stories?" I asked, half smiling. "Something like that," he said, his voice low. "If you're smart, you'll stick to the marked trails." I thanked him, but the map stayed in my hand. I couldn't help it. I was a sucker for old legends, especially the kind that locals were cagey about. And if there was something real out there, well, that's what my book was for. I found the trailhead just after noon. It wasn't marked, just a narrow path cutting through the underbrush, barely visible. The trees seemed denser here, their branches twisting together to block out the sun. I hesitated for a moment, Sam's warning echoing in my mind, then stepped onto the trail. The forest swallowed me almost immediately. The air was cooler, the light dimmer. The trail was overgrown, but I followed it carefully, stepping over roots and ducking beneath low-hanging branches. After about an hour, I noticed something odd. The forest was silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own breathing. That's when I found the first artifact, a child's shoe, weathered and partially buried in the dirt. It looked impossibly old, the leather cracked and brittle. My stomach tightened. Who had left it here? And why? I kept walking. I found more, a rusted lantern, a broken doll, the remnants of a wooden wagon wheel. They were scattered along the trail like breadcrumbs, each one more unsettling than the last. By the time I reached the settlement, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. Prospect Hollow was little more than a ghost town. The remains of a few cabins leaned drunkenly in the clearing, their roofs caved in and walls splintered. An old well sat at the center, its stones slick with moss. The place reeked of abandonment, but it also felt wrong. The kind of wrong that makes your skin crawl, though you can't say why. I found the journal in one of the cabins, tucked beneath a rotting floorboard. Its leather cover was damp and warped, the pages filled with spidery handwriting. Most of it was illegible, but I could make out fragments. They come at night. We hear them whispering in the trees. We'll join them soon. The final entry was clearer. They've come for us. Soon we'll join them in the quiet. A chill ran down my spine. I flipped back to the beginning, trying to piece together the story, but a sound outside made me freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. My pulse quickened. I stepped to the window, peering out. That's when I saw them. Figures, tall and thin, standing motionless at the edge of the clearing. Their shapes were human, but there was something off about them. Blurry, as if they were half there, half somewhere else. My breath caught. I blinked, and they were gone. I didn't run. Not yet. Part of me didn't want to believe what I'd seen, and another part didn't want to turn my back on it. I packed the journal into my bag and started back down the trail, my hands shaking. The forest felt different now, darker, heavier. The silence was oppressive, and I kept catching glimpses of movement in my periphery, shadows that didn't belong. Then the whispers started. They were faint at first, barely audible over the crunch of my boots, but as I walked, they grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic hum. I couldn't make out the words, but they seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. I stopped, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was silence again. Then a voice broke through, clear and unmistakable. "Ethan?" It was Caleb's voice. I stumbled back, my throat tightening. "No," I whispered. "You're not here." "Ethan?" the voice called again, closer this time. "I need you." I turned and ran. By the time I reached the campsite, it was dark. I collapsed against my trailer, my chest heaving, my legs shaking. For a moment, I thought I'd made it. Then I heard it. The sound of footsteps crunching the gravel behind me. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Sam stood there, his face shadowed under his hat. "Told you not to go," he said, his tone grim. "There's something out there," I gasped. "I saw them." "I know," he said. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "They're called the Quiet Ones. Settlers who got trapped between worlds. They feed on emotions, grief, guilt, anything they can use to pull you in." I shook my head, trying to make sense of it. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Would you have believed me?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Look, they've marked you now. They'll keep coming unless you do something about it." "What do I do?" I asked, desperate. Sam reached into his pack and pulled out a bundle of sage. "They don't like this. It's not a permanent fix, but it'll keep them at bay. You need to burn it at the edge of the trail where they can see." I nodded, taking the bundle. My hands trembled as I lit it, the smoke curling into the night air. The forest seemed to shift, the shadows pulling back. For a moment, the whispers faded. Sam stayed with me until morning, sitting silently by the fire as I tried to process what had happened. When the sun finally rose, he stood and looked at me with a mix of pity and caution. "You can't stay here," he said. "They don't give up easy." I packed my things and drove away, the forest receding in my rearview mirror. But as I turned onto the main road, I caught a glimpse of them. Figures standing at the edge of the trees, watching silently. I don't know if I'll ever be free of them, but I know one thing: I'll never forget the quiet. When I first arrived at Rock Creek Campground, I thought I'd finally found what I was looking for. Peace, quiet, and a place to forget. After the divorce, the house felt like a tomb. Every creak of the floorboards a reminder of how empty life had become. So I hitched my trailer to the back of my truck and headed west, hoping the mountains of Wyoming might offer some clarity, or at least a distraction. The campground was nestled deep in Medicine Bow National Forest, framed by jagged peaks and dense pine trees. My spot overlooked a pristine lake, the kind you'd see on a postcard. It should have been perfect, but from the moment I stepped out of my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't paranoia exactly, just a nagging sense that I wasn't alone. I spent that first day setting up camp and scouting the area. The air was crisp, the kind that bites your lungs in the best way, and the silence was almost soothing. I took a few photos of the lake and the surrounding forest, trying to rediscover the joy I used to feel behind the lens. It didn't work. Every shot felt flat, lifeless, like me. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I cooked a quick dinner and sat outside the trailer watching the stars blink into view. I'd almost started to relax when I heard it. Faint, rhythmic footsteps circling the trailer. I froze, the fork halfway to my mouth, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped, and I told myself it was just a deer or maybe the wind rustling the pine needles. But when I went to bed, I locked the trailer door, just in case. The next morning, I met Elliot. I'd been sitting outside, sipping coffee and debating whether I wanted to attempt a hike, when a kid emerged from the trees. He couldn't have been more than 11, with messy brown hair and a backpack that looked too big for him. He waved, grinning like we were old friends. "Hi," he said, plopping down on the picnic table across from me. "You here all by yourself?" "Yeah," I said cautiously. "Where are your parents?" He shrugged. "I live nearby, just like exploring the woods." He gestured toward my camera. "You a photographer?" "Used to be," I said, setting my mug down. "Now, I just do it for fun." Elliot's grin faded and his tone shifted. "You're not gonna go to the hollow road, are you?" "The what?" "It's this old road in the forest," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nobody uses it anymore. My grandpa says it's cursed." I couldn't help but laugh. "Cursed, huh? What happens if you go there?" Elliot looked away, his fingers twisting the strap of his backpack. "People who walk down it don't come back." "Sounds like a local ghost story," I said, brushing it off. "Don't worry, kid. I'm not planning to get lost out here." He didn't look convinced. "Just stay away from it, okay?" I nodded to placate him, and he wandered back into the trees. Something about the way he'd said it, though, stuck with me. That evening, I reviewed the photos I'd taken during the day. Most of them were ordinary: trees, the lake, the mountains. But one shot made me pause. It was of the forest, taken near my trailer, but in the far left corner, barely visible, was a shadowy figure. It looked human, but distorted somehow, the edges too blurry. I told myself it was probably a trick of the light and went to bed. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound I couldn't place. It was soft at first, like a whisper, but it grew louder the longer I listened. It sounded like knocking. I sat up, my heart pounding, and grabbed my flashlight. The trailer door rattled slightly, but when I looked outside there was nothing there. Just the forest, dark and still. I locked the door again, feeling foolish, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. I'd told Elliot I wouldn't, but I couldn't stop thinking about the hollow road. It wasn't on the campground map, but I figured if I followed the main trail far enough, I'd find it. I packed my camera and some supplies and set out, telling myself I just wanted a good story to tell later. The forest felt different that day. The air was heavier, the silence more oppressive. After about an hour of hiking, I found it. An overgrown path branching off from the main trail. A rusted sign jutted from the underbrush, its letters almost worn away. I could just make out the words, "Hollow Road." I hesitated, Elliot's warning echoing in my mind, but curiosity won out. I stepped onto the path. The trees here were denser, their branches weaving together like a canopy, blocking out most of the sunlight. The air grew colder, and the smell of damp earth was stronger. I took a few photos, though the place didn't seem like much. A narrow dirt road with weeds sprouting through the cracks. About half a mile in, I noticed the first strange thing. My compass, which had been clipped to my belt, was spinning wildly. I tapped it, thinking it was broken, but it didn't stop. Then I heard it, the whispering. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the whispers were too deliberate, too human. They sounded like voices, overlapping, speaking words I couldn't understand. My hands shook as I lifted the camera, snapping a photo of the road ahead. When I checked the screen, my stomach dropped. There, in the distance, was the same shadowy figure I'd seen in the earlier photo. But now, it was closer. I ran. I don't remember much of the hike back, only the feeling of being chased, though I never saw anything behind me. By the time I reached the trailer, my chest was heaving, and my hands were trembling so badly I could barely unlock the door. I slammed it shut and collapsed onto the bed, trying to convince myself I hadn't just seen what I'd seen. That night, the dream started. I was back on the hollow road, but it stretched endlessly, the trees pressing closer with every step. The whispers were louder now, and I recognized one of the voices. My ex-wife's. She was calling my name, her tone dripping with venom. "Michael," she said over and over, "you're a failure. You always were." I woke, drenched in sweat, the whispering still echoing in my ears. Elliot appeared again the next day, his face pale and serious. "You went there, didn't you?" he asked, his voice tight. "I shouldn't have," I admitted, guilt clawing at me. "But what is it, Elliot? What's out there?" He hesitated, then sat down on the steps of the trailer. "My brother went there a few years ago. He didn't come back. My grandpa says it's the spirits of the miners who died in the cave-in, but I think it's something worse. Something that likes to mess with your head." "I saw something," I said, struggling to find the words. "A figure." Elliot nodded. "That's how it starts. It shows you things, makes you doubt yourself. Then it takes you." His words sent a chill down my spine, but part of me didn't want to believe him. I needed answers, and the only way to get them was to go back. I waited until nightfall. The forest was darker than before, the shadows deeper, but I couldn't let it stop me. Armed with my flashlight and camera, I retraced my steps to the hollow road. It was worse at night. The whispers were constant now, louder than ever, and I felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me. As I walked, shadowy shapes darted through the trees, just out of reach of my flashlight beam. Then I saw it. The figure stepped onto the road ahead of me, fully visible now. It was impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its face featureless. It tilted its head, almost curiously, before taking a step toward me. I snapped a photo, the flash momentarily blinding us both. The figure recoiled, screeching, and I used the moment to run. But the road seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees closing in. I stumbled, falling to my knees, and the whispers grew deafening. "Michael." It was my ex-wife's voice again, but distorted, mocking. "You'll never be enough." "Stop!" I shouted, pressing my hands to my ears. "You're not real." The whispers stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. Then Elliot appeared, his face pale and terrified. "We have to go," he said, pulling me to my feet. "Now." Together we ran, the shadows clawing at our heels. The whispers returned, furious, but we didn't stop until we reached the main trail. By the time we made it back to the trailer, I was shaking so badly I couldn't speak. When I turned to thank Elliot, he was gone. The next day, I found a single photo on my camera. It was of Elliot standing on the hollow road, his expression sad and distant. I haven't been back to Rock Creek since. Some places are meant to be left alone. Photography was supposed to bring me peace. After the divorce, I needed something to focus on, a way to keep my mind off Stacy and the life we'd built and lost together. That's why I found myself at Point Lookout State Park, the kind of place she would have hated. Isolated, eerie, and heavy with history. The park was beautiful, I'll admit, but in a haunting way. The air smelled of salt and decay, and the Chesapeake Bay stretched out endlessly, gray and cold. My trailer was parked at one of the more remote campgrounds, surrounded by skeletal trees. I'd come here for inspiration, but the emptiness of the place was unnerving. Even the rangers seemed relieved when I told them I'd be staying alone. "People don't usually last long in this part of the park," one of them said, her voice low. "We get reports of weird stuff. Nothing dangerous, just unsettling." I dismissed her warning as local folklore. I'd heard the stories before. Ghost sightings, Civil War prisoners haunting the shoreline. It was the kind of thing that might make a good photo series, but I wasn't here to play ghost hunter. I just wanted to capture the bleak beauty of the park, and maybe, just maybe, reignite my love for photography. The first day was uneventful. I explored the trails, shot some landscapes, and tried not to dwell on the fact that the park felt unnaturally quiet. When night fell, I cooked dinner over a small fire and reviewed the photos on my camera. That's when I noticed something strange. In one of the shots, a panoramic view of the bay, there was a shadow. At first, I thought it was a tree branch or a trick of the light, but the more I looked, the less sense it made. The shadow was tall and thin, standing on the water like a black smudge. It hadn't been there when I took the picture. The air felt colder suddenly, and a shiver ran down my spine. I set the camera aside, telling myself it was just a glitch. But later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard them. Muffled cries, like someone shouting underwater. They were faint, distant, but unmistakable. I sat up, heart pounding, and strained to listen. Then came the whispers. Low and guttural, like a language I didn't understand. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, shining the beam into the woods. There was nothing there. Just the rustling of leaves and the distant crash of waves. But the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to follow me, circling the trailer like unseen predators. I barely slept. The next morning, I met Clara. She appeared out of nowhere as I was adjusting my tripod near the bay. She was young, mid-20s maybe, with curly brown hair and a bright smile that didn't match the somber landscape. She walked right up to me, her boots crunching on the gravel. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked. "Is it that obvious?" I replied, trying to keep the weariness out of my voice. She laughed. "You've got the look. Out-of-towner, searching for something. I'm Clara." "Ryan," I said, shaking her hand. She lingered, watching as I adjusted the settings on my camera. "You're into photography?" "Something like that." She nodded thoughtfully. "This place has a lot of history, you know. Dark history. The prison camp, the shipwrecks, the lighthouse." "Let me guess," I said, smirking. "It's haunted." Her smile faded. "You laugh, but people say the lighthouse is cursed. Folks who go near it at night don't always come back." I wasn't sure if she was serious or just trying to mess with me, but something about her tone made me uneasy. Before I could ask more, she turned and walked away, her figure disappearing into the fog. That evening, I decided to check out the lighthouse. It wasn't far from the campground, just a short walk along a winding trail. The building was imposing, its whitewashed walls stained with moss and salt. It looked abandoned, the windows boarded up and the door chained shut. I took a few photos, trying to capture the lighthouse's eerie charm, but when I reviewed them on the camera's screen, my stomach dropped. The lighthouse in the photos wasn't the one I'd just seen. In the pictures, it was crumbling, its walls cracked and its windows shattered. And in one of the frames I saw them, shadowy figures standing in the windows, their faces indistinct but watching. A chill crept over me, and I turned to leave. That's when I heard her voice. "Ryan?" It was Clara, or at least it sounded like her. The voice was coming from the trees, soft and distant. "Ryan, come here." I called out, but there was no response. Just the sound of waves crashing against the shore. The whispers returned that night, louder and more insistent. They filled the trailer, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then there was the knocking. Slow, deliberate taps on the trailer door. I froze, heart pounding. "Clara!" I called, my voice shaken. No answer. The knocking stopped, but when I looked out the window, I saw her. She was standing by the edge of the woods, staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. I stepped outside, but by the time I reached the spot where she'd been, she was gone. In her place was something else. A small wooden figurine, carved crudely into the shape of a person. Its surface was slick with dew, and its eyes were two black holes. I woke up the next morning with a pounding headache and a sense of déjà vu. The day unfolded exactly as it had the day before. Clara appeared by the bay, smiling and asking about my photography. I played along, but something felt off. Her words were the same, her movements identical. It was like watching a recording. That night, the whispers grew louder and the knocking returned. This time, I didn't answer. But the next morning, it happened again. The same conversation, the same strange sequence of events. I was trapped in a loop, each day blending into the next. I decided to confront Clara. When she appeared by the bay, I demanded answers. "What's happening to me?" I asked. "Why does this keep repeating?" Her smile faltered. "You shouldn't have gone to the lighthouse." "What's that supposed to mean?" She hesitated, her eyes darting to the ground. "It's not me you need to worry about." Before I could press her further, she turned and walked away, vanishing into the fog. Desperation drove me back to the lighthouse. It was the only place that felt real, the only place that might hold answers. I reached it just as the sun was setting, its fading light casting long shadows across the ground. The door was no longer chained. It creaked open as I approached, revealing a spiral staircase that wound into darkness. I hesitated, but the whispers pushed me forward. Inside, the air was thick and cold, and the walls were covered in strange, swirling patterns. At the top of the staircase, I found a small room with broken furniture and shattered glass, and in the center of the room stood the shadow prisoner. It was exactly as I'd seen in my photos, tall, thin, and featureless, its eyes glowing like embers. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. I felt my chest tighten, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispers became screams, and images flooded my mind. Stacy's face, her laughter, her tears as she packed her bags and left. The shadow prisoner was showing me my failures, my regrets, feeding on my despair. "You're mine," it said, its voice a chorus of agony. I stumbled back, raising my camera instinctively. The flash went off, cutting through the darkness and momentarily blinding the creature. It recoiled, its form flickering like static. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran down the stairs and out into the night, not stopping until I reached my trailer. I left Point Lookout the next morning, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. When I developed the photos from my trip, they were worse than I'd imagined. The shadow prisoner was in every frame, its silhouette lurking in the background. And in one picture, taken near the lighthouse, I saw Clara. She was staring at the camera, her expression blank, her eyes hollow. I haven't touched my camera since. Some nights, when the world is quiet, I still hear the whispers. Photography was supposed to bring me peace. After the divorce, I needed something to focus on, a way to keep my mind off Stacy and the life we'd built and lost together. That's why I found myself at Point Lookout State Park, the kind of place she would have hated. Isolated, eerie, and heavy with history. The park was beautiful, I'll admit, but in a haunting way. The air smelled of salt and decay, and the Chesapeake Bay stretched out endlessly, gray and cold. My trailer was parked at one of the more remote campgrounds, surrounded by skeletal trees. I'd come here for inspiration, but the emptiness of the place was unnerving. Even the rangers seemed relieved when I told them I'd be staying alone. People don't usually last long in this part of the park, one of them said, her voice low. We get reports of weird stuff. Nothing dangerous, just unsettling. I dismissed her warning as local folklore. I'd heard the stories before. Ghost sightings, Civil War prisoners haunting the shoreline. It was the kind of thing that might make a good photo series, but I wasn't here to play ghost hunter. I just wanted to capture the bleak beauty of the park and maybe, just maybe, reignite my love for photography. The first day was uneventful. I explored the trails, shot some landscapes, and tried not to dwell on the fact that the park felt unnaturally quiet. When night fell, I cooked dinner over a small fire and reviewed the photos on my camera. That's when I noticed something strange. In one of the shots, a panoramic view of the bay, there was a shadow. At first, I thought it was a tree branch or a trick of the light, but the more I looked, the less sense it made. The shadow was tall and thin, standing on the water like a black smudge. It hadn't been there when I took the picture. The air felt colder suddenly, and a shiver ran down my spine. I set the camera aside, telling myself it was just a glitch. But later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard them. Muffled cries, like someone shouting underwater. They were faint, distant, but unmistakable. I sat up, heart pounding, and strained to listen. Then came the whispers, low and guttural, like a language I didn't understand. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, shining the beam into the woods. There was nothing there, just the rustling of leaves and the distant crash of waves. But the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to follow me, circling the trailer like unseen predators. I barely slept. The next morning, I met Clara. She appeared out of nowhere as I was adjusting my tripod near the bay. She was young, mid-20s maybe, with curly brown hair and a bright smile that didn't match the somber landscape. She walked right up to me, her boots crunching on the gravel. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked. Is it that obvious? I replied, trying to keep the weariness out of my voice. She laughed. You've got the look. Out-of-towner, searching for something. I'm Clara. Ryan, I said, shaking her hand. She lingered, watching as I adjusted the settings on my camera. You're into photography? Something like that. She nodded thoughtfully. This place has a lot of history, you know. Dark history. The prison camp, the shipwrecks, the lighthouse. Let me guess, I said, smirking. It's haunted. Her smile faded. You laugh, but people say the lighthouse is cursed. Folks who go near it at night don't always come back. I wasn't sure if she was serious or just trying to mess with me, but something about her tone made me uneasy. Before I could ask more, she turned and walked away, her figure disappearing into the fog. That evening, I decided to check out the lighthouse. It wasn't far from the campground, just a short walk along a winding trail. The building was imposing, its whitewashed walls stained with moss and salt. It looked abandoned, the windows boarded up and the door chained shut. I took a few photos, trying to capture the lighthouse's eerie charm, but when I reviewed them on the camera's screen, my stomach dropped. The lighthouse in the photos wasn't the one I'd just seen. In the pictures, it was crumbling, its walls cracked and its windows shattered, and in one of the frames I saw them, shadowy figures standing in the windows, their faces indistinct but watching. A chill crept over me, and I turned to leave. That's when I heard her voice. Ryan? It was Clara, or at least it sounded like her. The voice was coming from the trees, soft and distant. Ryan, come here. I called out, but there was no response, just the sound of waves crashing against the shore. The whispers returned that night, louder and more insistent. They filled the trailer, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then there was the knocking. Slow, deliberate taps on the trailer door. I froze, heart pounding. Clara, I called, my voice shaken. No answer. The knocking stopped, but when I looked out the window, I saw her. She was standing by the edge of the woods, staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. I stepped outside, but by the time I reached the spot where she'd been, she was gone. In her place was something else, a small wooden figurine carved crudely into the shape of a person. Its surface was slick with dew, and its eyes were two black holes. I woke up the next morning with a pounding headache and a sense of déjà vu. The day unfolded exactly as it had the day before. Clara appeared by the bay, smiling and asking about my photography. I played along, but something felt off. Her words were the same, her movements identical. It was like watching a recording. That night, the whispers grew louder and the knocking returned. This time I didn't answer. But the next morning, it happened again. The same conversation, the same strange sequence of events. I was trapped in a loop, each day blending into the next. I decided to confront Clara. When she appeared by the bay, I demanded answers. What's happening to me? I asked. Why does this keep repeating? Her smile faltered. You shouldn't have gone to the lighthouse. What's that supposed to mean? She hesitated, her eyes darting to the ground. It's not me you need to worry about. Before I could press her further, she turned and walked away, vanishing into the fog. Desperation drove me back to the lighthouse. It was the only place that felt real, the only place that might hold answers. I reached it just as the sun was setting, its fading light casting long shadows across the ground. The door was no longer chained. It creaked open as I approached, revealing a spiral staircase that wound into darkness. I hesitated, but the whispers pushed me forward. Inside, the air was thick and cold, and the walls were covered in strange, swirling patterns. At the top of the staircase, I found a small room with broken furniture and shattered glass. And in the center of the room stood the shadow prisoner. It was exactly as I'd seen in my photos. Tall, thin, and featureless, its eyes glowing like embers. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. I felt my chest tighten, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispers became screams and images flooded my mind. Stacy's face, her laughter, her tears as she packed her bags and left. The shadow prisoner was showing me my failures, my regrets, feeding on my despair. "You're mine," it said, its voice a chorus of agony. I stumbled back, raising my camera instinctively. The flash went off, cutting through the darkness and momentarily blinding the creature. It recoiled, its form flickering like static. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran down the stairs and out into the night, not stopping until I reached my trailer. I left Point Lookout the next morning, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. When I developed the photos from my trip, they were worse than I'd imagined. The shadow prisoner was in every frame, its silhouette lurking in the background. And in one picture, taken near the lighthouse, I saw Clara. She was staring at the camera, her expression blank, her eyes hollow. I haven't touched my camera since. Some nights, when the world is quiet, I still hear the whispers. I arrived at White Sands National Park just before dusk, the gypsum dunes glowing faintly under the last light of the sun. The landscape stretched for miles in every direction, alien and unyielding, like the surface of some distant planet. It was the perfect place to get lost, and the perfect subject for the photography contest I'd entered. The prize money wasn't life-changing, but it was enough to help me keep this lifestyle of wandering, camera in hand, trailer in tow. I parked the trailer at the northern edge of the park, a spot I'd chosen specifically for its remoteness. Rangers said it wasn't a designated campsite, but I wasn't interested in campsites. I wanted solitude, unspoiled vistas, and a silence that would let me think for the first time in months. Unhitching the trailer was harder than I'd expected. The soft sand caused one side to sink slightly, making it lopsided. I cursed under my breath as I adjusted the leveling blocks, the first signs of a headache prickling behind my eyes. By the time I finished, the sun had fully set, and the dunes around me gleamed white under the rising moon. The first night was uneventful, though something about the quiet felt oppressive. Even in the wilderness, I was used to hearing something: crickets, the rustle of leaves, the occasional howl of wind. Here, there was nothing, just my breathing and the low hum of the trailer's generator. I woke early the next morning to a sinking realization, literally. The trailer had shifted during the night, one wheel partially buried in the sand. I spent half the morning jacking it up and trying to stabilize it. By the time I finished, I was sweating and irritable, not in the mood for distractions. That's when I met Nina. "Hey there," she called, her voice bright against the stillness. She was walking toward me from the direction of the dunes, a petite woman with dark hair tied back and a camera slung around her neck. "Morning," I replied cautiously, wiping sand from my hands. "You're camped in the north section?" she asked. "Brave choice. Most people stick to the south." "Why's that?" She hesitated, her cheerful expression faltering. Unstable ground and other things. What other things? She shrugged, forcing a smile. Just stories. Locals talk about shadows out here. People who lose their way. Hollow men, they call them. Hollow men? I echoed, raising an eyebrow. It's a legend. They say settlers vanished out here a long time ago, swallowed by the sand. Now their shadows wander the dunes, looking for company. She laughed awkwardly, like she wanted me to dismiss it as nonsense. I did. Interesting story, I said, not bothering to hide my skepticism. Yeah. Anyway, be careful. The sand can shift faster than you think. She nodded toward the trailer and gave a small wave before heading back the way she came. That night, the silence returned, thicker and heavier than before. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my camera settings and planning my shots for the next morning. But as I sat in the dim light of the trailer, I heard something. Faint, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Thump. I froze, listening. Thump, thump. It was coming from below. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the ground around the trailer. The sand was smooth, unbroken by footprints or tracks, but the sound persisted, growing louder. I knelt, pressing my hand against the ground. It was vibrating. By the third day, things started to spiral. My camera began malfunctioning, capturing distorted images even after multiple resets. Shadows appeared in the frames where none should have been, elongated figures stretching across the dunes, though I was alone every time. And then my father showed up. I hadn't seen Oscar in years. The last time we spoke, it ended in a shouting match, with me accusing him of being too controlling and him accusing me of wasting my potential. So when he stepped out of the dust, looking just as worn and weathered as I remembered, my first reaction was disbelief. "Ethan," he said, his voice steady, "you've been ignoring my calls." "What the hell are you doing here?" I demanded, not bothering to hide my irritation. "I felt like I needed to come," he said cryptically. "Something's wrong here. I can feel it." "Yeah, well, you're not helping," I snapped. "I don't have time for whatever this is." He stayed anyway, pitching a tent near the trailer like we were on some father-son bonding trip. That night, the voices began. At first, it was faint, indistinct murmuring just beyond the edge of hearing. Then, as the hours dragged on, it grew louder, clearer. "Ethan," a voice whispered. I sat bolt upright, my heart hammering in my chest. "Ethan," it called again, insistent. It was my own voice. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, shining the beam toward the dunes. The light wavered, casting jagged shadows across the sand. "Dad?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. "Dad, if this is your idea of a joke, it's not funny." The whisper came again, closer now. "Ethan, come here." I backed towards the trailer, slamming the door shut and locking it. The generator flickered, then died, plunging me into darkness. Oscar was gone the next morning. His tent was flattened, his belongings scattered, but there was no sign of him. Panic set in as I searched the dunes, calling his name. The shifting sands erased my tracks almost as quickly as I made them, leaving me disoriented. When I returned to the trailer, I found a note pinned to the door. The handwriting was shaky, unfamiliar. "You're next." Desperation drove me to the northern trails, to the spot Nina had warned me about. The dunes grew steeper, the sand finer, until walking felt like wading through water. I nearly turned back, but then I saw it. a clearing at the base of a tall dune. At its center was a circle of stones blackened by fire. A crude wooden figure stood in the middle, carved with strange symbols. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble. "Ethan!" The whisper was back, louder and more insistent. Shadows began to rise from the dunes, twisting into humanoid shapes. Their bodies were hollow, featureless, as if they'd been carved from the sand itself. I stumbled backward, my flashlight flickering as the figures advanced. "Ethan," one of them said, its voice eerily familiar. "It's time to stay." I don't remember running, only the sound of my heartbeat and the thump-thump of something beneath the sand. By the time I reached the trailer, the dunes were alive with movement, the hollow men closing in. Oscar appeared out of nowhere, his face pale, his eyes wild. "Go!" he shouted, shoving me toward the door. "I'm not leaving you," I yelled. "There's no time." He grabbed a flashlight from the ground and turned to face the shadows, drawing them away from the trailer. The last thing I saw was his silhouette, standing defiantly as the hollow men swarmed him. I drove out of the park at dawn, the trailer rattling as it bounced over the uneven terrain. When I finally stopped at a gas station miles away, I looked back at the dunes, half expecting to see Oscar walking toward me. But he never came. Weeks later, I reviewed the photos I'd taken. Most were blank, overexposed by some inexplicable interference. But one image stood out, a shadowy figure standing among the dunes, its hollow eyes staring directly at the camera. I don't know if it was Oscar. I don't know if I'll ever go back to find out. It's funny, the things you tell yourself when you're alone in the wilderness. It's just the wind, you say, even though the leaves aren't moving. It's just an animal, you mutter, knowing no animal could sound like that. But in the Sierra National Forest, alone with my trailer and my thoughts, no rationalization could drown out the whispers. I'm Danny Clark, an environmental scientist with a tendency to overthink and a recent divorce under my belt. I came here to escape the chaos of my life, to lose myself in the data, to breathe in pine-scented air instead of smog. The Sierra was perfect, remote, pristine, a place where no one could reach me. Or so I thought. I pulled my trailer into the clearing late in the afternoon. The pines towered over me, their branches knitting a patchwork of shadows on the ground. It was eerily quiet. No bird song, no rustling leaves. Just the crunch of gravel beneath my boots as I stepped out and surveyed the area. I convinced myself it was serene, not suffocating. The first day was routine. I set up my air quality monitors and wildlife cameras, marveling at how untouched everything seemed. My divorce felt like a distant memory as I stared into the endless green. By nightfall, I'd cooked a simple meal over my portable stove and crawled into the trailer, falling asleep to the soft hum of the generator. The first sign of trouble came the next morning. One of my monitors was malfunctioning, spitting out readings so erratic they couldn't possibly be accurate. Carbon dioxide levels spiked, then plummeted, then rose again. I spent hours recalibrating it, blaming the altitude or a faulty sensor, but then the others started acting up too. I was cursing at the equipment when I heard the crunch of boots behind me. Spinning around, I found myself face to face with a stocky man in a camouflage jacket. He had a broad grin and a hunting rifle slung over his shoulder. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said. "Name's Oz. I'm camped not far from here. Saw your trailer and figured I'd say hi." I nodded, wary but polite. He seemed friendly enough, though there was something about his grin that felt off, too wide, too forced. "Nice setup you've got," Oz said, gesturing at my monitors. "Doing research or something?" "Something like that," I replied, keeping it vague. Oz squatted by the fire pit I hadn't even used yet, poking at the ash. "You ever hear the stories about this place?" "What stories?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. His grin widened. "They say these woods aren't just woods. People go missing out here, hear voices calling their name like it's someone they know, follow the sound and poof, they're gone." I snorted. "Sounds like campfire nonsense." Oz shrugged. "Believe what you want, but I lost a buddy out here a few years back. Never found his body." Before I could respond, he stood and tipped his hat. "Well, I'll let you get back to it. But if you hear something, don't go looking." That night, I heard it for the first time. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, cutting through the stillness outside the trailer. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. The whisper came again, louder this time, like someone was just outside the door. "Danny?" My blood ran cold. It wasn't just a voice, it was familiar. It sounded like my ex-wife, Maria. "Danny, come outside." I grabbed a flashlight and flung the door open, shining the beam into the darkness. Nothing. Just the trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. No response. I stood there for what felt like an eternity before retreating back inside, locking the door behind me. I told myself it was exhaustion, maybe a trick of the wind, but deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I found claw marks on the side of the trailer. 4 deep gouges running parallel, too precise to be random. My breath caught in my throat as I ran my fingers over them. They weren't fresh, but they hadn't been there when I parked. Something, or someone, had been here. I spent the day checking my equipment, trying to focus on work and push the previous night from my mind. That's when I met Lila. She appeared out of nowhere, a slender woman with dark hair pulled back into a messy bun. She had a camera slung around her neck and wore a wary expression. "Are you the guy camped over by the clearing?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. "Yeah," I replied. "And you are?" "Lila," she said, "I'm photographing wildlife, or trying to, not much out here." She lingered, her eyes darting nervously to the trees. "Be careful out here," she said finally. "This place, it's not right." "What do you mean?" I asked, but she just shook her head. "If you hear anything, don't follow it." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving me more unsettled than ever. By the third night, the whispers were back, louder and more persistent. This time, they didn't just call my name. They laughed, low and guttural, like the wind itself was mocking me. My flashlight flickered as I stepped outside, the beam struggling against the darkness. That's when I saw the figure. It was just a shadow at first, standing between the trees. But as I moved closer, the shape became clearer. Tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that stretched too far and eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root and dropping my flashlight. By the time I scrambled to my feet, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I ventured into the northern trails against every warning I'd been given. My equipment had picked up strange energy readings in that direction, and I needed answers. The forest grew denser as I walked, the trees crowding together like they were trying to block my path. That's when I found the clearing. It was a perfect circle, The grass flattened as if something heavy had pressed it down. At the center stood a totem, a crude wooden figure, its surface carved with strange symbols. Stones surrounded it in a spiral, blackened by what looked like old fire. The air felt heavy, oppressive. My breathing quickened as I stepped closer to the totem, drawn by a force I couldn't explain. That's when I heard the voice again. "Danny." It was Maria's voice, clearer than ever, coming from the trees behind me. I spun around, and there she was, standing just a few feet away, her hair disheveled and her eyes wide with terror. "Maria?" I whispered, my throat tightening. "Help me," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Please." But something was wrong. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings, and her eyes, they were wrong. Too bright, too empty. I stepped back, my pulse hammering in my ears. "You're not real," I muttered. The figure tilted its head, its lips curling into a grotesque smile. Then it lunged. I don't remember how I made it back to the trailer. My legs moved on instinct, carrying me through the forest as the whispers grew louder, angrier. By the time I slammed the door shut behind me, I was shaken so badly I could barely lock it. The trailer shook as something slammed into it, hard enough to rattle the cabinets. Clawed hands scraped against the windows, and the laughter returned, echoing from every direction. Desperate, I grabbed my monitor and overloaded it, praying the burst of electromagnetic energy would disrupt whatever was attacking me. The device sparked and hissed, filling the trailer with a blinding light. And then, silence. When I stepped outside at dawn, the clearing was empty. No claw marks, no whispers. Just the trees, standing tall and indifferent. I drove out of the forest that morning, leaving my equipment and most of my belongings behind. I haven't been back since. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. They call my name, soft and insistent, just on the edge of hearing. And sometimes I wonder if I should answer. Never thought I'd write about this. I never thought I'd even say it out loud. But every time I close my eyes, I see it. I hear it. And sometimes I swear I still smell the sulfur. It all started when Max suggested we take the RV to Bragg Road in Texas. He'd found it in some article titled "Top Haunted Roads in America," and of course, he was giddy about it. Max loved anything spooky, the thrill of feeling afraid but knowing deep down it was all fake. He thought it would be perfect for my travel blog, clickbait gold. I'd heard of Bragg Road before, of course. The locals call it the Ghost Road, a desolate, unpaved stretch of dirt surrounded by dense pine forest, where people claim to see strange lights hovering in the dark. Swamp gas, some say. Others claim it's the souls of railroad workers who died nearby. The really superstitious ones, though, they talk about a crossroads demon. I didn't believe in any of it. Sarah, my younger sister, came along reluctantly. She had this naive fear of the supernatural that I always teased her about, though now I wish I'd listened to her. She said she wanted to prove she wasn't a baby anymore, but I think she just wanted to patch things up between us. We hadn't been close since Mom died, and I guess I hadn't made much effort. The drive out there was uneventful, though the farther we got from civilization, the more anxious Sarah seemed. Max, of course, teased her mercilessly, and I could see her clenching her fists in her lap. I didn't step in. Maybe I should have. We reached Bragg Road at sunset. The RV rolled to a stop, and All I could hear was the gravel crunching beneath the tires. No wind, no birds, no crickets, just silence. "Well, this is inviting," Max said with a grin, hopping out of the driver's seat. Sarah and I followed, though I noticed she stayed close to me. The forest on either side of the road seemed to press in, the trees impossibly tall and shadowed. I could feel the tension in my chest, but I shrugged it off. We set up camp just off the road, parking the RV near a small clearing. Max lit a fire while Sarah unpacked. I set up my camera gear, determined to capture every spooky detail for the blog. The first night was quiet, almost disappointingly so. No ghost lights, no eerie noises, just the occasional crackle of the fire and Max's dumb jokes. Sarah went to bed early, and I stayed up with Max, talking about nothing in particular. At some point, though, I realized the forest was completely still. No rustling leaves, no distant animal calls, just silence. "Do you hear that?" I asked Max. "What?" he said, looking at me. "Nothing," I whispered. That's when we saw it. A faint orb of light hovering in the distance. It wasn't bright, more like the glow of a dawn lantern, but it was unmistakable. "Holy shit," Max whispered, standing up. We watched as the light moved, slow at first, then darting left and right like it was searching for something. "Swamp gas," Max said, though his voice didn't carry the usual confidence. "Does swamp gas move like that?" I asked. Neither of us slept well that night. The second day was worse. We woke to find muddy handprints smeared across the RV's windows. They were small, childlike, but the fingers were too long. "Someone's messing with us," Max said, pacing in front of the fire pit. "Out here?" I shot back. "Who the hell would come all the way out here just to screw with us?" Sarah refused to leave the RV. She said she'd heard footsteps circling it in the middle of the night, followed by faint whispers. I wanted to brush it off as a bad dream, but the handprints made that impossible. Max and I decided to explore the area while Sarah stayed behind. We followed the dirt road deeper into the woods, looking for any sign of what or who might have been out there. That's when we found it, a clearing with a circle of flattened grass. In the center were piles of rocks arranged in strange patterns, triangles, spirals, symbols I didn't recognize. "This is messed up," I said, my voice shaking. Max crouched down, poking at the rocks with a stick. "Probably some bored teenagers or a cult." "Not funny, Max." I wanted to leave, but Max insisted on taking pictures. As we turned to head back, I thought I saw movement in the trees, just a flicker, like a shadow darting between the trunks. I didn't tell Max. That night, the generator failed. We were plunged into darkness, the only light coming from our flashlights and the faint glow of the fire. Sarah was on edge, jumping at every little sound. Even Max seemed quieter than usual. "I'm telling you, we should leave," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We're not leaving," I snapped. "We came here to write about the ghost road, and I'm not leaving empty-handed." "You care more about your stupid blog than us," she shouted, tears in her eyes. Before I could respond, we heard it. A low, mournful wail coming from the woods. "What the hell was that?" Max whispered, clutching his flashlight like a weapon. The wail came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. "Inside. Now," I said, pushing Sarah toward the RV. We locked the doors and turned off the lights, peering out the windows into the darkness. That's when we saw it. At first, it looked like a man, but it was too tall, its limbs too thin and long. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light of our flashlights like an animal's. "What is that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. None of us answered. Max, being Max, decided he needed to confront it. "I'm not just sitting here," he said, grabbing the rifle we'd brought for emergencies. "Don't be an idiot," I hissed, grabbing his arm. But he shook me off and stepped outside. "Hey!" he shouted into the night. "You're trespassing." The thing didn't move. It just stood there, watching him. Max raised the rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed through the forest, deafening in the stillness. That's when it screamed. I don't know how to describe the sound. It was like metal scraping against metal, like the wail of a dying animal, but louder and deeper than anything I'd ever heard. Max stumbled back, dropping the rifle, and the thing moved. It didn't walk. It sprinted, closing the distance between them in seconds. "Max, get inside!" I screamed, yanking the door open. But he didn't make it. Sarah and I watched in horror as the thing dragged Max into the woods. He didn't even have time to scream. "We have to go after him," Sarah cried, clutching my arm. "With what? A flashlight and a camera?" I snapped, though my heart was breaking. We locked ourselves in the RV, sitting in silence as the hours dragged on. The forest seemed alive now, filled with the sounds of snapping branches and faint whispers. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke to Sarah shaking me. "Jess," she whispered, her face pale. "He's back." I followed her gaze to the window, and there he was, Max, standing just outside the RV. "Let me in," he said, his voice calm. Something was wrong. His clothes were torn, his face smudged with mud, but his eyes, they were empty. "That's not him," I whispered, my stomach turning. "Jess, please," he said again, his voice cracking. "It's cold out here." I wanted to believe it was him. I wanted to believe he'd somehow escaped. But then he smiled, and his teeth were all wrong, jagged and too many. I grabbed the matches from the counter and lit the pile of bones Sarah had found earlier, praying it would do something. The flames roared to life, brighter and hotter than I expected, and the thing outside let out a terrible shriek. When the fire died down, Max, or whatever it was gone. We found our way back to the main road at dawn, leaving the RV and everything inside it behind. I don't know what happened to Max. I don't think I ever will. But a part of me thinks he's still out there, wandering the woods, trapped between this world and the next. Sometimes, late at night, I hear his voice calling my name. And sometimes I almost answer,